There are a lot of things that I read because of FOMO. Like, I just want to see what the hype is about. And then when people are talking about something, like what are they talking about, right? I have to say, I mean, it kept my attention, right? I mean, the writing is terrible and cringy. So definitely, like, it was pretty clear to me, of all the things I've read in my 46 years of life, that would be the lowest for me. But I couldn't pick the highest.
All right, hey.
Hey.
It is another edition of Bookish, a casual book club. I am Kofi Adisa here with my favorite two people, other than my family, Sylvia Lee and Laura Yu.
Hello.
Hello.
And today we are talking about what makes something a highbrow or lowbrow, or what do we really mean by something being highbrow and lowbrow? And this conversation came out of, like many things we do, text messaging. I wish we were that, formal and everything, but we're a casual book club. So, and I think the thing that I've often wondered about, since I took this class in graduate school some years ago called Literature and Crap.
Really? That's what it was called?
That was what it was called. It was also the same semester I took the women's intellectual course. And so it was a very interesting counterweight to that class. And so some of the things that I think about what makes it highbrow or a text that's highbrow is that it is with the capital L literature, right? And so that is fairly recent within the last 200-something years because poetry and drama typically have been considered the high art forms, right? So people became poets, and then you had the romantics who made it seem like poetry could be just about anything. And then you have folks like Walt Whitman and their work. You don't just go to a bookstore and let me get that latest Walt Whitman. It's usually for a class. You're usually in a university setting or school setting. And so highbrow almost always connoted education, right? We're always learning through the classics, as they're called. But what makes them classics isn't necessarily what makes them enjoyable, right? And so I think the example I used was Henry Fielding, whose book Tom Jones. Sorry, this is about to be boring, because I was, a wannabe 18th century person, and I remember learning how his work, as well as Dickens and a lot of others, were serialized at first. They weren't already a novel. The novel was just it was an embryonic form, and it became something unique in the last, I would say, 200 years or so. And even within the novel, there are certain novels that are seen as important to either American culture, Russian culture, West African culture, but almost always centralized in the university. So does that make it a highbrow, or is it the depth of it? And part of this came out of a discussion with Frankenstein that I never read.
Shame on you.
And I'm proud of it.
I'm going to tell your wife that.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell your wife.
I told her that. I'm very proud of my ignorance of Mary Shelley.
Oh, what? How dare you?
Again, this is an example of elitism.
No. And this is listeners out there, this is what got us on this topic because, we're like, it's a classic. It's how can you not Frankenstein? It speaks to your soul because, you will have maybe seen the new Guillermo del Toro version of it on Netflix, which I thought he did a beautiful job of bringing that story to life. But, we're talking, it's a classic, and then that dovetailed as it does in our text conversations. Who decides, right? Who decides what's high art, highbrow? Who decides what's low art, lowbrow, right? And this also coming off the heels of the announcement of the Booker Prize winner. And that's considered a highbrow literary award. And for our listeners out there, if you're not familiar, The Vegetarian, for example, was one that these are books that launch careers and establish certain authors and their work as part of canon. And many of them will go on to win Nobel Prizes, things like that. Highbrow, high art. But fundamentally, who decides? And to Kofi, your point, the entire genre of the novel was considered lowbrow, right? For a lot of that beginning period when the genre was really born. And, now it's considered part of the highbrow. So who decides. We had this was a head scratcher of a topic. I was like, well, our listeners, like, it seems kind of random, but really, like, I was at dinner last night with some friends and I asked them, they're not very literary or anything like that, but I asked them, like, about this concept. And they're like, that really applies to all art forms, right? Like, one of them's a musician and we were talking about, well, what makes music highbrow versus lowbrow, right? And not just like classical music, but even like in a genre like hip hop, right? And they're like, there's hip hop royalty, and then there's like kind of, crappy hip, but who decides, right? And we were there at this like dinner. It was like a fancy dinner. And then we're like, same thing with culinary arts, right? Highbrow food versus lowbrow food. And oftentimes these things flip-flop, right? Yeah. Like what we eat now may have been considered peasant food like back in the day. And now people will pay like a ton of money to have something that's a low, cheap cut of meat, for example. And
because it's in fine dining.
Yeah. And who's deciding this? And often we came down to the conclusion that in some areas it's whoever is in power, right? And whoever has the money. And a lot of times this intersects with like whoever is educated. And they can set that tone or that trend. And, I was thinking about when specifically like the novel, like Austen, right? Like what if Jane Austen was considered like the Twilight Saga of that time, like.
It was.
Yeah. And Laura is an 18th century. So Laura, I'm curious to know because like you studied, this period of literature for your whole master's. That was your master's degree.
So I was going to say, I was also an aspiring wannabe 18th century scholar. Like when I started my PhD, the first time it was in 18th century. But I think that's when we see the rise of the novel. That was the whole thing that I studied. And the difference is that up until then, you have these stories that are epic, right? About knights and kings, right? And nobody cares about the common man. But it's the novel that starts to tell stories about like Robinson Crusoe, for example, with some people would consider that the first novel. So, and it was about a dude who gets stranded on an island, right?
Right.
So then you have, and then even when you get to Jane Austen, I don't know if you guys read Northanger Abbey.
Yeah, she makes fun of it.
That's right. Yeah. And there's this debate about the value of novel reading and how novel reading is dangerous for young women, and especially the Gothic novel, for example, right? It's all trash. So I think I love this debate because that discussion can happen at huge, big levels, all the way down to in a small, just like you were saying, even within the novel genre, what is considered lit fiction versus the grocery store reads that we talked about, for example, right? Even in that. And maybe even among the thrillers, there is the
highbrow, like literary merit thriller.
And so in some ways, there's no real answer to this question, except I think you found the right word, Sylvia. I think it does have to do with power and power structure and who gets to speak and
preserve that power.
You think about someone like William Shakespeare, and we definitely romanticize Bill a little too much, in my opinion. But if Samuel Johnson didn't write about him, then we probably wouldn't be talking about him in the same way. And if Harold Bloom didn't make him the inventor of humans, then we probably still wouldn't be talking about him in the same kind of way. And it's not just Harold Bloom or Samuel Johnson. It's people who have the ear of the power elite, right?
Yeah.
And so, and universities at one point was considered that place. One, because they were extremely exclusive. Or I should say discriminating. And so the novel as a genre, as well with poetry, I would say, became kind of genderized. And I think that was fairly late in their forms. But it still, you still wonder if I find as a reader value in Walter Mosley, but I don't find the same value in Toni Morrison. There are probably people listening who would question my readership or literary understanding or even intellect because Toni Morrison is considered very high art. I'm not saying she's not. I am not saying
He said considered.
Yes, I did. But I find, I always ask people, and this is not picking on Toni Morrison, but I'm going to use Toni Morrison as an example. How many people actually read jazz and understood it?
I know I read it, But like most books, I don't remember it, obviously. And so I don't know if I understood it. I don't know. But I know I read it because you had to.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
So if you look at Sula and then you look at Jazz, which one was more readable? Or The Bluest Eye?
Yeah, I was thinking of The Bluest Eye.
Yeah.
So some of them, so even within that artist,
Yeah.
Or Song of Solomon, or Beloved.
or any one of those, even within their own genre, there's something that's considered higher and something is lower. And usually the thing that's lower is something that anyone can read.
And you know what? That's where I was wondering where you were going with that particular example, because I see that, I guess it's related to the idea of power, right? And it's what is accessible. And so when you think about things that were considered lowbrow, even within the novel at the, nascent era of that genre, it is usually what made it accessible to a wider variety of common or not part of the established, let's just say male, right, elite group. So anything geared towards women or that women gravitated towards, right, seen as less than, lower brow, dangerous,
like
right?
romance.
Yeah, no intellectual merit. What's the point of reading novels? It's just frivolity, right? Even within, so your example of Toni Morrison, but even within poetry, so you see it very vehemently in poetry. So you have high art poetry, right? Like in the past, poetry that has skill and technique, heavily embedded into it. Not that it doesn't right now, but meter, allegory, metaphor, all of these things. It's like a tightrope, act that the poet is doing. And then over time, as the genre begins to evolve, you have other forms of poetry that's breaking out of that fixed form poetry, right? And then free verse comes onto the stage and people lose their minds, right? Confessional poets, right? And that's kind of seen as a little bit lower brow. You're just like, what? You're just like saying all this stuff, Sylvia Plath, like what's wrong with you? Or like Anne Sexton, right? It's considered like if you're morose and depressed, But then I see it even recently too. So you have a distinction in the world of poetry between high art literary poetry and then like slam poetry, right? Or I hope I don't offend any of our listeners or readers, but like Rupi Kaur or whatever her name is, right? Like when someone usually says like that's who they read, I can see, right, other people react like, oh, okay, right, versus another obscure literary poet,
right,
who people will recognize as somebody who's been accepted by the Academy, usually as you've won this prestigious award or something to that effect. And I think that really does order the way we see it. But for the popular crowd, does it matter? Isn't the point that they're reading poetry, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that what's important? Does it matter if it's considered I don't know.
High or low? Yeah.
Like Robert Frost is an interesting example, right? For a long time, everybody, if you were talking about a poet, everyone would recognize Robert Frost, right?
Because so much depends on a red wheelbarrow.
That's William Carlos Williams, my friend. Well,
there you go.
No, Robert Frost is two paths.
Oh, that's right.
And I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And everyone's like,
snowy something.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so much does still depend on that.
Yes, glazed with rainwater besides
the white chickens. Yes. Yes, William Carlos Williams.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know. I think it's an interesting thing to think about.
And when we were texting, I think I said something about, does something that is considered lowbrow starting out, but if it becomes a subject of study, intellectual study, then does it become highbrow?
Yeah.
And I was thinking of, right? Like it's the subject of study. So let's take graphic novels, for example, right? Or comic books or whatever. Obviously, now it's become a popular thing that you study if you're English major, right? Or some kind of cultural studies kind of course or whatever. But before it was a subject that you could study, like I don't think people looked at comic books or graphic novels as highbrow. But now it's become so, one, studied, and two, mainstreamed that like I feel like in the last few years, only thing my kids have read are graphic novels.
Yeah.
And even like books like Watership Down has a graphic novel version, and that's the only version they'll read, right? The Bible. I mean, everything is sort of in graphic novel form. Right. So I thought about that, like when things, if grocery store reads became a major subject of study,
Oh, yeah.
then it becomes, subject of highbrow.
Or like in 200 years, if someone looked at these grocery store reads as a subject of study, as a commentary on culturally what is happening, would it then now become highbrow the way we look at novels from 200 years ago? And a friend of mine who we were having dinner with, Christine, if you're listening, so shout out to you, she said, does this mean we're just getting dumber and dumber, like progressively? Like our tastes are getting lower, or are we like over intellectualizing everything, And I was like, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either.
But have you thought about, I kept staring at my bookshelf, like the other day when we were texting about this, I happened to be sitting in our book room or reading room or whatever, and I'm looking at my bookshelves and I'm thinking, which of these books here would I consider as maybe the highest of the highbrows and lowest of the lowbrows that I would have read.
Okay.
Have you thought about
and what
that?
was it? What was your
Well, for sure the most lowest I have gone and couldn't get any lower is 50 Shades of Grey.
Wow.
And that's what we read read that one for the podcast.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are a lot of things that I read because of FOMO. Like I just want to see what the hype is about. And then when people are talking about something, like what are they talking about, right? I have to say, I mean, it kept my attention, right? I mean, the writing is terrible and cringy. So definitely, like, it was pretty clear to me, of all the things I've read in my 46 years of life, that would be the lowest for me. But I couldn't pick the highest.
Let me ask you this. Is it lowbrow because of the amount of reading you've done as opposed to the salacious reader who likes tabloids, who likes erotica, who likes all these other things? So maybe because I didn't do that, but I thought about all the books that I've read.
Yeah.
And the Iliad and the Odyssey or the Gilgamesh, they're all considered high art.
Yeah.
Not because I think they're high art, but because of the subject matter and because of the ideas and because of school.
Right. What's associated with that reading.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's true.
But when I read Chester Himes, I didn't necessarily read Chester Himes in school. And I find him funny. I find him engaging.
Yeah.
Kind of misogynistic, but
Kind of.
you know,
Kind of.
But he was writing of his time.
Yes.
Or even if I look at going back to Walter Mosley, especially his Easy Rollin' Tales, they're very different than his more literary, like R.L. Dreams. It's very different than his writing on, or The Blue Light. They're very different than Easy Rollin' Tales. And so I wonder if it's something about being the reader, or being a reader, that you end up making that decision.
Yes, and you're right about your individual person's history of reading, right? Like I did it as my major, right? But plenty of people don't approach reading as a subject of study, right? It's something they enjoy. Like I watch movies or listen to music. I'm not a student of those things. I just watch them for entertainment. But I have a different background, right, in engagement with literature. It was a subject of my study. So I think that does, of course, it shaped my repertoire of reading. Yeah. And so maybe I don't even have a lot of other lowbrow books in my repertoire to compare. Right. Maybe it can go lower. I don't know.
The bar could always go lower.
I would think grocery store reads would be down.
But I hope I'm open to, for me, what makes something high or lowbrow, because I was thinking about, as a reader, is really the quality of the writing.
Yes.
And it doesn't even have to be consistent. It's kind of so I was watching a clip, there was some kind of figure skating event recently or whatever, and I was watching a clip of this young woman figure skating, and there's something about when they're that good, it just looks like a dance and so effortless, and the jumps. And that's how I think about the writing, when they just are making me forget that it's writing, that it is something else. And that's what I consider to be, I guess, highbrow of literary merit. And it is informed by my training and my background and my area of study, sure. But I find myself things I rejected in the past, like Bill, William Shakespeare, right? I was watching, John and I watched some of the Macbeth, the one with, the new one. Can't even remember. I can't remember the actor's name. And I remember like watching, like getting halfway through, and I was like, this blows. I'd rather read the book. Right? And I was like, you know what? I do want to read the book because I was recalling certain lines that just were like so good. So I like picked up the book that I had, and I just like read it in the weekend. I was like, I forgot how good Macbeth was.
It's so good.
It's so good. And then same thing with Frankenstein, you know, like some of the lines in there that just really like just feels like a gut punch, you know. And who is it? It was Emily Dickinson who said, you want to feel like the top of your head has been blown off a little bit, you know, and just going back to parts of Frankenstein and be like, oh my God, that's such a good line. Like, how is she 18 and writing this line, you know? Like, I feel like that's, you know, have I felt that way with contemporary fiction? Yeah. I think I have in poetry. Yeah. There have been like certain things where I just like really like it. And I feel that way when I'm consuming other like media or arts too, like shows, TV shows. It's why, you know, The Simpsons is one of the GOATs, right? Like it's so good because there's the comedic timing in some of these things are just hilarious. I was watching... It was on TV. We're watching like Rush Hour 2, right? It just happened to be on.
Okay.
And there's a scene with Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan. And it was so, I just totally forgot about that movie. I mean, I think it's horribly racist against Asians, but I totally forgot about that scene. And I just was dying laughing. And I don't remember enjoying it before, you know? And it has nothing... Rush Hour 2 is like a lowbrow. It's not like the height of cinematic like art, but it was just such a good like comedic. I just appreciated the timing of it.
Within the genre of comedy or that type of art is done so well that I don't know.
It's no
filmmakers
Beverly
out
Hills
there.
Cop, I tell you that.
It's no like Eddie Murphy at Constitution Hall, and like you know, like it's none of that. Like that's even comedy has its own like you know magnum opus. But this was not that. It was just really funny and well written.
And I just want to say, I will read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
You don't have to.
I will.
I don't want you to feel pressured, Kofi.
I'm not. But I do live with a woman who is... She's going to watch the Frankenstein movie on Netflix at least 9 more times.
Okay.
Because she's seeing so many different patterns.
Yeah.
Because Angie, my wife, was also an English major and appreciates the word transformed into the visual.
Yes.
Maybe we should do a future episode on Frankenstein.
Okay.
I would love the opportunity to reread it.
Then Angie should take your place for that.
Oh, you know what? She would be more than...
Angie, you are invited to take Kofi's place.
If you want to talk about The Godfather, she could talk about that.
I actually really like The Godfather.
I think it's overrated.
Wait, 1, 2, or 3?
All 3.
Oh.
Wait, the book? What are we talking about?
The book
movies?
is good, too.
Oh.
Yeah, the book.
Oh, I never read the book.
See?
I'm more into high art. And last thing I would say, my wife was having this conversation with our son, and she was telling him how really she felt so sad for his generation because they don't have any really good hip hop artists. Like all the hip hop artists suck. And so my son was arguing that, you know, he was listing out Kendrick Lamar and all these other people, and she was like, no. That's part of my generation. No, your generation. Name someone out of your generation. And, you know, he's 17 and he struggled to come up with a name because every name he had was within our purview. And so, you know, at best he could say Sexy Red. And, of course, or Glorilla or... You know, I had names for him, and he didn't even know because he was like, "I don't listen to that."
What about Doechii? Would Doechii be considered part of that?
I would say Doechii.
I don't even know how old she is. I thought she was younger.
She's in her 30s.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, then she's not.
Yeah, she's kind of in her 30s, but I think she's only had, you know, her success is recent within memory, and so his argument was that Kendrick Lamar at his prime was within his generation. And my wife was like, no, he was not. And so what I equate that with is that even within certain genres, there is always some level of gatekeeping. by the people who are most intimately connected to that space, right? And so do I think Kendrick Lamar is the same as Rakim? No, I do not. If I were going to rank them in terms of high art, in terms of rap music, of course Rakim would be more higher than that because Kendrick Lamar learned a lot from him. He even said so. So, but if you're talking about popularity and who are more
commercially successful
or relevant at this point, people would say Kendrick Lamar. And I think that is how highbrow and lowbrow work. That whoever is relevant at the time and the power structure that enables that,
Right.
I think readers will identify that way.
Yeah. And that changes throughout time,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
And then because different criteria are being applied in a different context among different people.
Yep.
So I think, like, while it's a fun discussion, right? I mean, there's no one measure or one thing that we can apply to answer that question. I did find it interesting. I learned, because the first thing I looked up was etymology of highbrow. Apparently it comes from that idea that if you had high forehead, that you were more intelligent. This comes from like 18th, 17th century, BS.
Yes.
So that's apparently where the brow thing comes from. Because I was like, where do we even get that from?
Interesting.
So very interesting conversation, guys.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Well, I hope the readers, our listeners thought it was interesting.
I hope so too. And really, it's so hard to just like what you like, I guess, It doesn't,
In the end, you're going to read the things that you find interesting and impactful. And most of those things will not be something you studied in college.
Yeah. And we talked about before how different each of us approach different forms of art for different reasons, right? Purposes. So depending on why you read, you might pick this kind of a book that is highbrow or lowbrow versus a different kind of book. And I think it does come down to that, individual choice. But I do think it's worthwhile having these discussions about how do we decide, who gets to decide, and what's at play when we talk about, because ultimately it does have an impact on what we value and judgment and prejudice and discrimination, right?
Yeah, and the act of discovery, right? Like, I think gatekeeping is such like an interesting concept to bring to this conversation because there is an element of that. And people who control what it is that we have access to in terms of marketing certain books and things like that. But ultimately, I think for every reader, it's a personal thing that you're doing when you're consuming any art, right? Keep on discovering, folks.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks everybody for tuning in and listening to us. You can check out Bookish, a casual book club, wherever you get your other podcasts too. So thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time.
See ya.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed what you just heard, we have a whole universe of podcasts waiting for you. Simply search Dragon Podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. You can also explore our full lineup and discover new shows at podbean.com/dragonpodcasts. That's podbean.com/dragonpodcasts.